The GNOME gconf configuration tool. Yes, the UCP curriculum suggests that you even need to know graphical tools associated with configuring GNOME. To that end, the GNOME configuration editor can be started with the gconf-editor command. Yes, the configuration editor window which opens has a look and feel somewhat similar to Microsoft's registry editor, and any changes made through the configuration editor, like with the registry editor, are reflected immediately. When the gconf editor command is run by itself, it edits the GNOME settings for the current user. If it were run with the sudo command, it would edit the GNOME settings for the root administrative user. Yeah, you'd rarely change that in Ubuntu Linux, as Ubuntu systems strongly discourage such logins. However, if you ever want to change mandatory or default gconf settings, you would want to run sudo gconf editor. Otherwise, the new defaults window and new mandatory window shown here are grayed out. Changes made to default or mandatory settings are reflected in the etc/gconf directory in the gconf.xml.defaults and gconf.xml.mandatory subdirectories. And I should also say any changes made to user gconf configuration are reflected in the user's home directory in their hidden .gconf subdirectory. Now let's go back to the configuration tool. gconf settings are available in 4 or 5 areas. We start with the Apps section, which can help you configure settings for GNOME applications. The Desktop section has settings associated with the behavior, look, and feel of the GNOME desktop environment. If you've configured more than one language on the system, you may also see a GNOME category at this level. That would be associated with language settings. Since I don't see it, I can only assume that only one language has been installed on the local desktop. Schemas are associated with documentation. Finally, the Systems section is associated with the behavior of proxy services, the mounting of non-Linux partitions, and non-Linux shared directories, Samba workgroups, and domains, and more. To repeat, as with the Microsoft Registry Editor, changes made through the configuration editor are reflected immediately. So be careful with what you do here. And if you want to experiment with the gconf editor, say with your local account, I suggest that you back up your current gconf settings in your .gconf subdirectory. GNOME configuration files. GNOME gconf configuration files can be divided into 3 categories: mandatory, default, and user. Mandatory and default settings generally apply to all users. gconf configuration files in all 3 categories are set up in XML format. The GNOME configuration file associated with mandatory and default settings is gconf-tree.xml. And yes, that's the % that starts the name of the file. Each user configured on a GNOME system has a .gconf directory in their home directories. The dot in front means it's hidden. Configuration commands or directives can be found in a gconf.xml file in a number of these subdirectories. User configuration files are organized functionally. For example, user fonts for the Evolution Personal Information Manager are stored in the user's home directory in the gconf/apps/evolution/mail/display/fonts directory. When gconf configuration files are meshed together, they're considered in the following order of priority: mandatory, user, and default. In other words, mandatory settings apply to all users and override any settings created for the specific user or any default settings. Whereas user settings in the user's home directory, the gconf subdirectory, override any defaults that may exist. And default settings apply only if there is no mandatory or user configuration for the particular setting. If you understand XML, you'll realize that gconf configuration files are normally pretty simple. The language looks similar to HTML, and the entries here for Evolution fonts are sort of what they look like. In other words, the entry is whether or not to use custom fonts, and the answer is a Boolean, in other words, true or false. Since it's false, custom fonts are not used on this particular workstation. GNOME configuration commands. Anything you can do with the gconf configuration editor, that's what we started in the GUI with the gconf editor command in another video, can also be done with the gconf tool-2 command. Be aware, gconf tool-2 is a standard configuration command associated with GNOME version 2.x. gconf tool-2 is a rich and complex tool, befitting its abilities to configure and read fine details of different GNOME applications and more. When run appropriately, say with the --recursive-list switch, it can be focused on specific gconf categories, such as apps. And once run in this fashion, it lists all gconf settings for GNOME applications. Gosh, that's a lot of settings. Similar lists, as suggested here, are available in other categories. To isolate this a bit, to make things more readable, we can be more specific. For example, the following command, as shown here, lists the current settings for the GNOME sound recorder, which I've opened here. We can focus the list a little bit more by adding, in this case, the system-state to the noted path to configuration. As you can see, no value is set for the open file directory. So if I click open, it automatically looks for a sound file or other files in my home directory. Let's change that. For the purpose of this video, I've created a sound subdirectory in my home directory. So to set the value of the GNOME configuration for the open-file directory, I can use the set switch. Let's look at a generic version of this command. I run gconf tool-2 --set using the path to the configuration file. That's a subdirectory of my home directory in the gconf subdirectory, specifying a specific type and value courtesy of the --type switch. The type can be an integer, which I'd substitute for the italicized type in the command, or it could be a string, or it could be a Boolean value such as true or false. But any changes I make are reflected immediately. So if I run this particular command, I click the open button, and it immediately looks for a file in my home directory in the sound subdirectory. Let's cancel to get back out of here. And we can reverse the process. All I need to do is substitute unset for set. And since we're unsetting the value, we don't need any of this type integer, string, or Boolean stuff. I confirm that the value is unset. I click open. And look at that. It looks for files in my home directory. Yeah, I could go on and on and on with different GNOME gconf settings with the gconf tool-2 command. But now you know the basics, at least as defined in the UCP curriculum. Custom panels, menus, icons, and more. The panels, menus, icons, and so on are components of the look and feel of a GUI desktop environment. First, let's look at the panels. On the GNOME desktop, there are the thin strips at the top and at the bottom of the desktop screen. The menus are normally located in the upper left corner of the desktop. And let's see what you can do to customize a panel. I right-click on an empty area of a panel. I click Add to Panel from the pop-up menu that appears. That opens the Add to Panel window, which includes a number of pre-configured applets which I can add to the panel. I can also select the properties for a panel and customize the look and feel of that panel. Its location, the size of the lettering on the panel, its behavior, and even things like background colors. Now, what can we do to customize other things? Let's customize the menu. That's made possible courtesy of the a la carte command, which opens the main menu window. If you choose to show an application, that application is added to the Applications menu. Next, there's the GNOME Appearance Properties command, which opens the Appearance Preferences window, which provides more look and feel options for the GUI, whether it be the basic theme, the background wallpaper, the font shown in the desktop, the look and feel of menus and toolbars, as well as other visual effects. A lot more options are available from the Compiz config ccsm, Compiz config settings manager. And there are a whole variety of options here in a number of different categories. Another custom tool relates to mouse or pointing device management, which I can open with the GNOME Mouse properties command. What you see here depends on the kind of mouse you have and whether or not you have a touchpad, such as what's common with many laptop systems. Next there is the Sound Preferences tool, which I can open with the GNOME Sound Properties command. It allows you to configure sound events, sound software, system beeps, system sounds, and more. Now to customize the behavior of GUI windows, run the GNOME Window Properties command, which customizes the behavior of a window depending on where the mouse pointer is, when the title bar is double-clicked, and so on. Now let's look at desktop icons. They're basically shortcuts to applications and/or files. If you have an icon on your system, you can right-click it and see the options. I don't yet, so I look for the fundamentals of a desktop icon available in .desktop configuration files. For example, I examined the evolution.desktop configuration file in the user share app-install desktop directory. It's got a lot of basic information, and these are the 4 important commands, which executes the evolution command to open the Evolution Personal Information Manager. It uses the Evolution icon. It does not open Evolution in a command line terminal, and it specifies that it's an application. So let's create a shortcut with this information in mind. I right-click on the desktop and click Create Launcher from the pop-up menu that appears. And based on the information from the evolution.desktop file, I know it's an application. The name is Evolution. And as soon as I type in the evolution command, notice how the icon changed. I type in a comment, I click OK, and I have an icon on the desktop which can be used to open the Evolution Personal Information Manager. And there it is. These are the basic options to customize the look and feel of a system. Xserver concepts and configuration files. First, aware that while the Xserver is the foundation of GUI desktop environments such as GNOME, it is a separate system. It is one of the areas where Ubuntu Linux depends on, in just a few cases, proprietary restricted drivers associated with closed source video cards. If such drivers have been installed, they can be managed with the Hardware Drivers tool, which you can start with the jockey-gtk command. It opens the Hardware Drivers window, and as you can see, I don't have any proprietary drivers, and they are pretty rare. Dynamic configuration is made possible courtesy of the xrandr system. It supports quick changes with the monitor resolution settings, as well as the screen and graphics preferences tools, which can be started with the GNOME display properties and display config-gtk commands. I'll discuss those tools in another video. For more information on xrandr, you can install the grandr package. In a GUI, you can run the grandr command, which opens a tool which illustrates various xrandr modes, such as display modes, rotation, layout, and hotkeys. Courtesy of the Bulletproof X system, there are failsafe files which are now part of the X server, as well as the GNOME Display Manager. The GUI login screens and GUI servers are still available courtesy of the Bulletproof X system, even if some of the main X server files are missing. So what are these main X server files? Well, the main configuration file for the X window is etc/x11/xorg.conf. But there's also a so-called failsafe X server file available, xorg.conf.failsafe, which I'll analyze as a generic X server configuration file. If you don't see this .failsafe file on your system, run the sudo etc/gdm/failsafe dexconf script. It creates a new version of the xorg.conf.failsafe file. If you don't have that dexconf script, chances are that the X server isn't properly installed on the local system, as that script is part of the x11-common package. Okay, let's open up that xorg.conf.failsafe file. I open it with a less pager so I don't accidentally make any changes. Be aware what you see in this file are generic settings, used when there's a failure in the basic configuration. First, you'll see 2 or 3 input device stanzas. And yes, they're related to input devices. What you see here is a generic keyboard, a generic mouse. If you have a touchpad, you'll see an input device stanza for that as well. The configured video device specifies the VESA driver. VESA stands for the standard of the Video Electronic Standards Association, also known as Super VGA, a generic standard which should work on almost all modern video cards. The configured monitor section is just a generic monitor. Note the display mode shown here, which combines the settings from the video device and monitor sections. Finally, the server layout section puts this all together.